I insist that what it is to be a woman, or indeed what it is to be a man or any other gender, is an open-ended
seeking to
question.
stop refugee services.
Trump signed the order last month.
Do you believe in God?
The more I look at the universe, just the less convinced I am.
Of these wildfires sweeping through LA
Can you be more
right
precise
now.
about what's potentially dangerous? You know, write your college paper for you.
It's in big trouble. It's very difficult for anybody to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
Hi everyone. When I was in 9th grade, my family moved to a new city called Erie, Pennsylvania. Anybody ever heard of it? I'd grown up in a small town called Corey, and that's where my friends were. That's where my home was. That's where I was comfortable. And we sold our home in Corey, and I'll never forget crying like a baby as I walked for the last time through that empty bedroom where I grew up. And so we came to Erie. I spent my first summer in Erie locked in my room listening to Amy Grant cassette tapes. That's how bad it was. And the first day of school was brutal. I knew hardly anyone. I was in a confusing building. Nothing was familiar. The first lunch was lonely. Things that were second nature before, like eating and talking to people, they now felt like insurmountable obstacles. I wonder if anybody's ever had that experience, like being the new kid, being the new guy or gal, being the stranger, the one everybody ignores, no one's talking to, that disorienting feeling of being the outcast. Well, that pales in comparison to really millions of people experiencing true displacement every single day all around our world, some by choice, some by force. And if you turn on the news or scroll social media, it seems like immigration is nothing more than a political football being kicked back and forth between two sides. The rhetoric gets heated, the positions become entrenched. Build the wall, some shout, and no human is illegal. Others are responding. And then the Bible gets thrown into these inflammatory, statements by both sides. It gets misused, even weaponized to score political points. On the one side, you hear, but Joseph and Mary and Jesus, they were illegal immigrants in Egypt. Even though there's no evidence that their journey was illegal and that their eventual return suggests they were more like asylum seekers than anything else. And then on the other side, people are claiming, but Nehemiah, built a wall around Jerusalem. And so God clearly supports border walls to keep out foreigners. Conveniently forgetting that Nehemiah's wall protected against military enemies, not families seeking a better life. And these distortions, they push us toward two extreme positions that seem like they're the only two options. One extreme advocates for open borders, sanctuary cities, voting rights for all arrivals, no matter their status. The other extreme promotes a kind of a closed-door, isolationist mindset that can easily slide into prejudice and xenophobia. To be clear, the Bible condemns both of these extremes. And between this cultural shouting match, many Christians are left wondering, well, what does God actually think about all this? A recent survey found that only 12% of American evangelicals say their views on immigration are primarily influenced by the Bible. The other 88% cite media or family and friends or personal experiences as more influential in their views than God's word. And that's a problem. But what if we've been missing something profound? Like, what if beyond the heated political debate, God has been trying to show us an entirely different perspective? As we continue our series called Counter Culture today, I want to ask, what if the arrival of strangers to our shores isn't just a problem to solve or a crisis to manage, but from the Christian perspective, what if it's actually an extraordinary opportunity to be considered? Now, before we go there, I want to talk just what's the real situation. And as far as I can tell, we all know about statistics these days, but while most immigrants are in compliance with U.S. law, a minority, likely somewhere between 10 and 12 million, are here unlawfully. Just over half of those individuals cross the border illegally, while between 4 and 5 million entered lawfully on temporary visa statuses, but overstayed their visas. And so where do we go from here? Well, this is the first of 4 controversial issues that we'll cover this month. And I want to start with a couple of foundational ideas that'll hopefully serve us well through this whole series. The first one is that it's just one of our core values. Our core value as a church says that we invite conversation because authenticity disarms divisiveness. And so these next few weeks would be a great chance for us to practice this value. Let it shine bright as we consider these topics. Maybe in your life groups or around dinner tables or over coffee with friends. We invite conversation even over the tough stuff. But here's the problem. Feels like to me during the last 15 or 20 years, we've gotten terrible at conversations, especially controversial ones. It's like we don't even know how to do it anymore. And so let me provide a principle and a picture as we begin, again, for the whole series. Here's the principle. The principle is disagreement does not equal hatred. We have to stop this nonsense that says if we disagree with each other, we must hate each other. Never in history has this been true. In fact, just the opposite. Genuine love often requires honest disagreement. So I can listen respectfully to my Hindu neighbors without embracing their beliefs and still offering them authentic friendship and respect and them to me. Similarly, we can engage respectfully with those who hold different views on sexual ethics or political methodologies or policy issues while still maintaining genuine care for one another as people. Disagreement does not equal hatred. That's the principle. Here's the picture. Let's call it the me, you, it framework. And it goes something like this. Before me and you talk about immigration policy or any controversial subject, I want to establish something important. I'm encouraging us to literally say this before your conversation. I value you as a person made in God's image. Your dignity and worth are not up for debate to me. And I hope you see me the same way. So this is me and that's you. And as we discuss this really complex issue, let's establish that you are not your political position and I am not my policy preference. You are not immigration policy. I am not border security or something like that. Those things are the it. It is the issue that we're talking about over here. It exists apart from us. And so we can examine it, we can debate it, we can even strongly disagree about it without it affecting how I view you as a person because you are not it. You are a fellow human being whom I respect regardless of where you land on this topic. No matter how passionately I might disagree with your perspective, I'm never going to question your value or your worth as a person because of it. So this is the foundation for the kind of conversations that our divided culture desperately needs. And how we as a church want to frame this idea that we invite conversation. Now, the real challenge we face in these conversations is what sociologists call enmeshment. And this happens when your political views become so fused with your personal identity that any disagreement about politics feels like a personal attack against you. So the you and the it merge together until you can't tell where you end and it begins, or me and it merge so that when somebody critiques, for example, my preferred policy, or my preferred political leader, it feels like they're attacking my deepest self. But that deepest self, that identity is the space only Jesus can occupy. Our political talking points were never meant to occupy that space. And so our primary identity is in Christ. It's not in our stance on border security or immigration reform. This is me, you, it. And it's a framework that gives us a way forward as we discuss controversial topics like the one today about immigration. It helps us remember that we can disagree about policies while still valuing each other as image bearers of God. And with that in mind, let's explore what it means to think about immigration, not just politically or not just culturally, but Christianly. That's what we're trying to do this month. Now, this is no walk in the park, because here's the Christian conundrum. Christians of all stripes want to hold a position of compassion for neighbors and hospitality for strangers and immigrants without being accused, by the way, of harboring gang members or stacking the next election with free votes. And Christians of all stripes generally believe that our country should have a secure border and a safe and just and fair system for determining who's allowed to enter the country and who should be sent out of the country, and how many migrants can we effectively integrate into our society every year, and so on. Without being called, by the way, racists or bigots or xenophobes. But here's the conundrum for Christians. If I were giving it a name, I would call it competing biblical obligations. So when we go to the scriptures for guidance, and we're going to go to two key New Testament passages today to demonstrate this conundrum, there can be this tension. Let's look at Romans 13, 1 and 2. Romans 13, 1 and 2 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. And so many people read that text and they say, well, see, that it's easy. It's an open and shut case. What part of illegal immigration don't you understand? And people will respond, but most migrants haven't done anything illegal. And then the response back is, well, the fact that they came in illegally makes them illegal. And then the point is that anything bad that happens to them as a result of that illegal entry is just God's judgment on people who don't obey the laws of the land, as clearly stated in this passage in Romans 13. Now, the problem with making a passage like Romans 13 an open and shut case on this issue is that you then have to make it an open and shut case on every issue. For example, the Bible also acknowledges such a thing as unjust laws, and that Christians are called to resist such laws. For example, if a Christian doctor was forced by the government to perform abortions, most people who are making this argument wouldn't run to Romans 13 as the open and shut case and say, well, that doctor should just obey the government. They would probably say, well, in some cases, laws are immoral. And in those cases, you have to push back or resist those laws. Now, again, I'm not suggesting one way or the other right now about our immigration laws, whether they're just or unjust, although I think everyone agrees there's a lot of work to do to make them better. I'm just saying, be careful of the Bible passages that you deem to be the end-all, be-all on an issue, because there are usually other Bible principles, biblical principles at play that need to be understood. So in this case, one of those other principles is these pesky words of Jesus over in Matthew 25:35. This is Jesus, and he says, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And remember what happens. The people ask him, well, when were you hungry and when were you thirsty and when were you a stranger? And he said, what you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And the word that he uses here for stranger, this is how Jesus identifies himself now, is this Greek word xenos, which means foreigner, outsider, someone who's not part of the community. It's where we get our word xenophobia. So we have these competing passages, and we see that this is not simple. Just in these two texts, and there are many others, we find what I called competing biblical obligations. It's not one verse and we're done and everything's solved. Christians need to wrestle deeply with, what does it mean to think Christianly about this issue? How does a renewed mind, like we talked about last week, how does a renewed mind that is being overcome by the ways and the works of Jesus and the works of the Holy Spirit of God, how do we process this thing that our country is experiencing with such a renewed mind? Now, one more thing as we consider a complicated issue. There are just some important distinctions that we need to keep in mind. The first is ancient versus modern. Like as we look to the Bible for guidance in an ancient world, things like borders had to do much more with, rivers and mountains and handshake agreements, and far less are they defined like modern nation states. Ancient societies were built around clans and ethnic groups, not centralized national identities like we have today. There was no welfare state. So the vulnerable were supported through mechanisms like gleaning of fields, not some sort of centralized government programs. So we have to realize that whatever we come up with isn't going to be a one-to-one comparison between ancient and modern. The second distinction that's important is biblical principles versus specific policies. So it would be wrong to think that the Bible somehow prescribes specific immigration policies for the United States in 2025. It doesn't do that. But what it does is to lay out timeless principles about God's heart for displaced people and how governments should function and values that should guide our responses. And so these principles, they require thoughtful application and often involve kind of balancing these competing values, as we've seen. The next distinction is immigrants versus refugees. There are different categories that call for different approaches. This is true both in the ancient world and in modern times. So in modern times, the terms immigrants generally refer to people who chose to leave their country seeking better opportunities, while refugees, they were forced to flee persecution of some kind. And our laws have always recognized the distinction between these two groups, offering asylum and protection to those who are facing genuine persecution. The final distinction I want you to see is national policy versus local responsibility. And so while our vote can influence national policy, we have much more control over our personal response at the local level. And so it's one thing to argue about laws and policies on social media about what's going on nationally. It's another thing to roll up your sleeves and to make a difference in our local community. And so the better question isn't, what side should I take? It's, how has God called me to respond as a follower of Jesus in my place and in my time? So let me play my hand in today's big idea. What if immigration was not a threat, but an opportunity to make disciples of all nations? Now, instead of proof texting and trying to shoehorn the Bible into different national policy debates, I want to look at some broad biblical principles related to this subject. Let's call it 3 ways to think Christianly about immigration. Here's the first principle: that God has always commanded compassionate provision for the displaced. So the Bible is a story of immigrants. Abraham was called to leave his home and travel with his family to a land where God would show him in Genesis 11. And Joseph, after rising to prominence in the land of Egypt, petitioned the Pharaoh, remember, to allow his father and brothers to seek refuge in Egypt as resident aliens in Genesis 37 and 50. Moses fled Midian to seek asylum as a political refugee after he killed the Egyptian in Exodus 2. After being delivered from slavery in Egypt, the Israelites would be given the land of Canaan as an inheritance, and they were given strict instructions, having been immigrants themselves, about how they were to treat foreigners and strangers and immigrants in their midst. Ruth immigrated and then assimilated into Israel, adopting the values and the culture and the religion of her mother-in-law, Naomi, after her husband died. David fled to Moab. He even sought asylum with the Philistines while he was on the run from King Saul in 1 Samuel 22. And my point here is nothing more than that the Bible makes clear that God has a heart for the immigrant, for the refugee, for the resident alien, for the stranger and foreigner. The rhetoric that has emerged among some Christians saying, just deport them all, get rid of them all. This has created an atmosphere where immigrants can begin to feel like enemies. And with a steady diet of these kinds of talking points, the word immigrant in some circles has come to be associated with words like criminal or terrorist or freeloader. And most immigrants are none of those things. Painting them as such is just morally wrong. Most, including those who are technically here illegally, are normal people trying their very best to care for their families. And Christians in particular should be the last to allow heated rhetoric to foster an ungenerous spirit or a hostile spirit within us. In fact, Christians should always default to hospitality over hostility. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan. The hero of Jesus' story was an enemy foreigner, a good Samaritan, 2 words that weren't supposed to be used together. Because the national religious leaders, the priests who should have helped, refused to help the person in trouble. And so the point of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan was redefine who Christians think of as their neighbor. Yes, the very neighbor that Jesus mentioned in the Great Commandment when he says the whole Bible can be summed up into 2 principles. Love God with all your whole heart and love your neighbor, there's the neighbor, as yourself. And then Jesus goes on to redefine neighbor as not just the person whose address is next to yours in the condo, but the people that God has placed in your path, whoever God has placed in your path, even those, listen, who you may not think deserve your compassion. Jesus is like, yes, that kind of neighbor, that's the one that I'm talking about. That's the one that you need to love in the same way that you love God, in the same way that you love yourself. But listen, while God clearly shows compassion for the displaced throughout the scriptures, he also establishes systems of order through human governance. And these are the 2 truths that create this tension that we feel. So the second way to think Christianly about this issue is to understand that God establishes government to maintain order and promote flourishing for its citizens. So we can all agree, listen, that all human governments will be far from perfect. But the passage that I read earlier in Romans 13 goes on to say that kind of the purpose of governing authorities. And the purpose of governments are to restrain evil, to promote good, and to serve the well-being of its citizens. And this involves enforcing justice and maintaining order through laws that provide stability for a society. As Michael Walzer has argued, regulating membership to a country through both admission and exclusion is essential in preserving what he calls a community of character. This is the responsibility of governments. I mentioned earlier the difference between immigrants and refugees. And well, the Bible also establishes distinctions between different groups within a society. It gives them different rights and responsibilities. And so let's go to ancient Israel. There were three primary categories. One was citizens. These were native-born Israelites who could claim all the rights and privileges of Hebrew citizenship. These citizens were full members of the community who shared in its values, adhered to its laws. They were committed to the worship of Yahweh as God. Deuteronomy 23 outlines some of these citizenship privileges. There are also what were called resident aliens. And there's this Hebrew term here at GAR that's used to refer to strangers or sojourners or newcomers who had integrated into the Israelite society. And though they were distinct from citizens, resident aliens could enjoy many of the same privileges. There were also expectations. They were expected to work. They were expected to respect Israel's laws and even participate in corporate worship. Importantly, God specifically commanded that this group must not be exploited ever or mistreated. They were to be treated with dignity and fairness, even as their status remained slightly different from full citizens. There was a third group that were called foreigners, and this third category consisted of people who maintained their distinct cultural identity. They did not integrate into the Israelite society. They were not afforded also the same rights or privileges of citizens or resident aliens, often because they refused to live by the culture and beliefs of Israel. Now, the fact that they refused citizenship to this group wasn't considered cruel or oppressive, but it reflected God's desire for Israel to maintain its character as a covenant community. And again, these biblical categories show us that having distinctions between groups within a society and even treating them differently isn't inherently immoral or evil. It reflects the reality that nations have both borders and identities that should be respected. And while our modern situation, as we've established, is far different and far more complex, it's also not reason to throw up our hands and just accept, one extreme position or the other, like wide open borders or completely closed borders. Most Americans, really across the whole political spectrum, agree that our immigration system is really broken and desperately needs to be reformed. In fact, if you go back for about the last 5 presidential administrations, they're all on record talking about how broken the system is. They all have also records of massive deportations. This is not a new situation, but it's been compounding to the point where it truly needs to be addressed. For decades, the U.S. has done a lot of eye-winking, even encouraging people to come across the border and establish themselves here without proper documentation. And now, here we are, several generations of undocumented families have built lives here with our implicit approval. And to remove those families now just feels like it's inhumane. Furthermore, there's been no clear path for many immigrants to gain citizenship once they've been here temporarily. About 40% of all undocumented immigrants initially entered the U.S. legally with visas, but they were unable to extend those visas because the process was difficult, and so they just chose to remain here unlawfully. And then there's also this criminal element to all this, which, like all criminals in our society, need to be dealt with and removed, honestly, swiftly for the protection of our citizens. But my point here is this, that we know different categories existed in ancient Israel under God's leadership, which suggests that having an orderly immigration system with different statuses for different people isn't inherently unjust. It's how we treat people within those categories that determines that. And so when we distill the biblical teaching, we see 2 truths seemingly in tension. 1, God has always commanded compassionate provision for the displaced. And 2, God establishes governments to maintain order. And while our social media world tells us that these two things are opposites and you have to choose the extreme of one side or the other, those of us who know the scriptures and know our God understand that these truths can coexist. They must be harmonized together. They remind us that our approach to immigration must acknowledge both order and compassion, both security and hospitality, both law and mercy. But as we stand in this tension, we also need an anchoring truth. And each week in this series, we're exploring a character quality of God that provides solid ground amid kind of the swirling controversies. And today, that character quality is God's justice, which is a refuge for the vulnerable. Biblical justice, this word mishpat, it isn't what most Americans think of as justice. We often view justice and mercy as two opposite things. Mercy lets people off the hook. Justice brings down the hammer. But Scripture reveals them as two sides of the same coin. Merciful love naturally overflows in just actions. And so at its core, mishpat means treating people equitably. This includes penalties, appropriate penalties for wrongdoing. It also ensures everyone has basic rights. And so Proverbs 31:9 commands us, defend the rights, that is the mishpat, of the poor and the needy. Biblical justice means equal treatment, whether through punishment or protection. And throughout the Old Testament, mishpat consistently appears in relation to what scholars have called the quartet of the vulnerable. 4 groups: widows, orphans, immigrants, and the poor. Today, we might include groups like homeless and elderly and disabled and victims of trafficking. And this isn't just a nice idea, this idea of justice. It flows from the very character of God. Psalm 33:5 says he loves righteousness and justice. Psalm 97 declares, righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Notice again the connection between justice and righteousness, which is why I love this simple working definition of justice, that justice is making wrong things right. And when we consider both of our earlier principles, God's compassion for the displaced and his design for orderly society, justice becomes the bridge that connects these two ideas. And why is it important for us to get God's perspective on this whole issue? Well, because before we are citizens of the United States, before we are citizens of any tribe or clan, we are citizens of the kingdom of God first. And the earthly expression, the earthly expression of God's kingdom no longer comes primarily in the form of a nation like it did with ancient Israel. It comes in the form of a church. And not just a local church, but a global, multi-ethnic church that spans the whole globe. Peter calls us, as Christians, aliens and strangers in this world. And at the same time that we are immigrants just passing through this world, we are also, in the process, ambassadors of God's kingdom. We speak on behalf of his kingdom. We are bringers of his kingdom and of his justice. That is, helping God to make wrong things right. And this perspective now moves us from the abstract policy debates to personal responsibility and action. What, as Christians, can we actually do? Well, we can actually do some things. And so I come back to this big idea. What if immigration was not a threat, but an opportunity to make disciples of all nations? In fact, guys, God may be orchestrating one of the greatest missionary moments of our time, not just by sending us overseas, but by bringing the nations to us. And so what might this look like in our context? How can we move from biblical principles to practical engagement? Well, let me offer this next step today. Would you consider volunteering to help local immigrants and refugees? Now, let me explain. About 10 years ago, I saw a special on the BBC, the British Broadcast Company. And they were doing this story on an amazing city in the United States that had become a safe haven for refugees from all over the world. And I was like, I wonder what city that is. And they said, the city is Erie, Pennsylvania. I almost spit out my water. I was shocked. Did you know that 1 in every 10 citizens of the city of Erie is a refugee? Now, this is not a new development. Back in 1910, over 25% of the population of Erie was refugees. And so this has always been a part, for whatever reason, of our community's DNA. There's a large population from Bhutan, and from Bosnia, and from Africa and Iraq. These are hardworking, upstanding communities of people, many of whom fled their country because of war and persecution, and they've come right here into our community, not knowing a soul, not knowing the language, not having any connections. Many of them, they have children to care for, and here they are. I was talking recently to one of our teachers at an elementary school in the heart of the city, and she said her classroom every day looks like the United Nations. Jesus said in his Great Commission to go into all the world and to make disciples of all nations. And then it's as if he looked down and he said, but I'm going to make it easy on you folks in Erie. I'm going to bring the nations to you. The world has arrived at our doorstep. And so maybe this moment we're in presents a divinely orchestrated opportunity to join God in his mission. Maybe this season represents our greatest hope for Christian renewal, not only in our community, but in our nation and around our world. If ever our immigrant communities were hungry and open to the love and hospitality of the gospel, it may be right now in this moment. And there are some great organizations locally and great opportunities to get involved through Serve Erie. I'll point out a few. The U.S. Committee for Refugee and Immigrants has a local Erie office, has opportunities to volunteer all the time, as well as Catholic Charities and the Multicultural Community Resource Center. So if you go to serveerie.com, this is kind of like a one-stop shop. If you click on the Get Started button and then sign up for a Volunteer Matters account through Serve Erie's website, from your profile there, you'll be able to have access to many of these partner organizations that you can sign up to serve with. And as we wrap up, I want to bring us back to where we started, that feeling of being a displaced stranger, the new one. But now as we look at it through the lens of God's redemptive plan, the current immigration situation presents us with a choice. Will we see it primarily as a political problem to solve? Or will we recognize it as a divine opportunity to fulfill the Great Commission? Will we see the stranger as someone Jesus died for? Will we choose hospitality over hostility? Guys, let's be a church that doesn't just debate immigration policies, but demonstrates Christ's love to those who, like all of us at some point, need to find a place to belong. I love you guys.